or the Judean brethren by this collection. And the Macedonians begged to participate in it. And Paul said, I've been boasting about you, so prove yourself. And so Christianity is really going to be seen on the everyday level. And one of the identifying marks of a Christian is that we are givers. And we're not talking about to the church. We're talking about just out in the world on a daily basis. And it's something that is between you and God, the amounts you give. But we saw that he loves a cheerful giver, right? And when God sees a cheerful giver, and that's interesting, when we comment on that, it's one of the few times, if the only time, God specifies the kind of person he loves. And it's what? A cheerful giver. Not just a giver, but a cheerful giver. And what makes a cheerful giver? Someone that's purposed in their own heart, and they give willingly, not grudgingly. And then the promise, of course, back to it is God's going to give back to you because he says, I can work with this person. He's using these things that I blessed him with as stewards to help others. And he's working for me because God uses us to do his will. So he says, I'm going to bless you. And then notice some of the things it produces. And when we look in the last few verses, when you are living a life this way. So verse 11, you'll be rich in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. Verse 12, for the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, that's in Judea where the money was going, but it's overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ, for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all. And while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for this, his indescribable gift. So help me point out some of the things that happens because if they participate in this giving in a cheerful way. First of all, verse 11, what does it say? You're going to be enriched with all things, okay? And then second of all, what's it going to produce? Okay, thanksgiving to who? And now that's interesting. Have you ever had someone say, I thank God for you. In my prayers, I just want you to know, I thank God for you. Well, when you see people living like Christ and living like Christian, it generates thanksgivings to God on your behalf. And that's what a beautiful thought. Now, what's the next thing it produces there in verse 12? Again, it supplies the needs of the saints, and that's the biggest thing. It takes care of them, and that's the goal here. And then, of course, that's, again, more thanksgivings to God. But verse 13, what does it say that this giving is? This great grace, this ability to give. It's a what? Of proof of what? It's proof. See that? It's proof given by this ministry. They will glorify God for your obedience. So it's proof, and I'll come back to that, and they're going to now glorify God. Now, Jesus said the same thing, that you let your light shine before men, so when they see your good works, what do? All right, so there's something intrinsically related to the works that we do and how people perceive our God. And so when they see the good works, they'll thank God for you and speak well of you, but most importantly, they'll glorify God. Well, why? Well, because it goes back to this proof. And notice the next thing it says. Because of this proof, they'll glorify God for your obedience. What? To what? There's a big phrase here. To your confession of the gospel. Now, have you ever talked about someone obeying their confession. You ever had a sermon or a topic about that? But isn't that what he's talking about here? The obedience of your confession of the gospel. What does it mean to obey your confession? Brad?
ESV actually uses the word submission.
Okay, submission. All right. And I'm not sure if it's supposed to be, I think it's supposed to be more obedience, but that's fine, yes.
Follow through what you said you would do.
Okay, follow through. And what is it about our confession, the gospel, that we need to follow through on? Okay, but what specific?
You made a commitment that when you obeyed the gospel that you were going to die to yourself and obey Christ. So you followed him.
Okay, and that's true, but there's something specific I'm looking for that when I confess Christ and the gospel and I said yes, and I accepted, now I'm going to obey that. What, Ann? Well, that's right, exactly. Yes.
You're going to be a servant.
Why would you say you're going to be a servant when you confess the gospel?
We're Christian, Christ-like, and that's what he was a servant.
All right, because when you come to Christ, the first thing you're struck with, this man is not just a man, this is God, right? And then the second thing you're struck with is what? That's it. It's not just a man died for you. This is God, and he died for me, right? Why? And it's because love. And when you confess your faith in Christ, you're saying, I believe you are not just a man, you're the Son of God, and you died for me so I could become part of your family. That's part of your confession. And I believe in grace, that type of you doing something for others which they can't do for themselves, which they don't deserve. I believe it in so much, I accept it in my life. Now I'm going to obey that philosophy for the rest of my life, that ethic, you know what I'm saying? I'm going to be obedient to that confession by showing that same type of grace to others, because I believe in it. I believe in who you are and what you stand for. And since I'm going to accept it, I have to then give it to others, or else I'm not being obedient to my confession. Does that make sense? Now, a lot of people say, well, a lot of people in the Christian world, and I say that loosely, faith is just a quick fix to their problems. Then they go back to living their own life. No, faith is a total submission to who Jesus is and his lifestyle and his ethic and his norm. Well, to the truth, and it changes us. It's transformative. And so that's why he says, your giving is proof of your obedience. It's proving you're really a genuine Christian, a child of God. That's what John said in 1 John 3. By this we know the children of God and the children of the devil. What's the difference? They love. That was the standard by which you know the difference. They love the children of God. You mean it's just that simple? Yes, that's all it is. It's just that simple. It's not complicated being a Christian. Doesn't require a lot of knowledge. It's just you're touched by God and you become like him and you start loving. And that's what he's saying here. So isn't that interesting, all these things he says, the proof of your ministry? So let's make sure I didn't skip anything. Many thanksgiving to God. And on this, they're going to end up praying for you because they're so touched by what you did for them. And then Paul just finishes, thanks be to God for this indescribable gift. What gift is he talking about? He doesn't tell us. It could be Jesus. Because that's all this gospel of Christ. It could be what else? Well, that would be part of Jesus and the things he gives. I don't know who said that.
Their willingness to give their...
All right, this grace that they can, this grace, what we're speaking of, this ministry, this gift to be able to gift others. It's a gift is what he's talking about. Just the opportunity is a gift.
Giving their love.
That's right. So what a indescribable gift. The opportunity to bless others. To work with God and for God. And it could be either or. Jesus himself, or just this privilege to help others. Now, I don't know if you look at giving as a privilege, but that's the way Paul presents it here. It's a privilege to be like Christ. Yes?
Well, I look at it as a way to give love to somebody you never met.
Oh, yeah.
Talk to.
Yeah. And there's some indebtedness here, too, as we referred to, because where did Christianity come from? Where did the gospel originate? Well, in Judea, among the Jews. And so Paul said, you're indebted to them, because that's where your faith came from. The gospel came from there. So that's chapter 9. I wish we could spend more time, but I want you to see for the rest of our time together, just chapter 10, verse 1 through 5, if we get that far. Now, there's going to be a whole transition and a change here, and so we'll try to clarify that for you. But let's read the first 5 verses. Well, actually, verse 6, but we're not going to get through it. He says, "Now I, Paul, myself urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I am meek when face to face with you, but bold towards you when absent. I ask that when I'm present, I may not be bold with the confidence which I propose to be courageous against some who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. For we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And we're ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete." How many of us are familiar, at least just are aware of this text, all right? A lot of things are said about this text, about spiritual warfare and demons and all that, but it's really not as involved as some people make it out to be, but yet this text is really, really powerful. Now, Paul's making a transition from everything he's talked about, and we want to outline that when we look in chapter 10. He's going to be really talking about winning a spiritual war. Let's look at the life of Paul real quickly, okay? We know that he was probably born about 5 BC, so he would be older than Jesus. And for the first part of his life, we know him as the persecutor, right? And what big event changed that? All right, when Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and that's where in Acts 9 he became a Christian. Totally changed his life, and from the persecutor, he now became the persecuted, didn't he? As a preacher and apostle. And I put those together because he was both, wasn't he? And but he is now the brunt of the persecution, just totally turned around. And so when we look at it, his death was probably around 67, 68 AD. And when we look at this lifespan between Acts 9 and when he was about 35 years old to about 68, he calls this whole walk as a Christian as a war. He said, "Oh, really? It's a war." Notice what he said in 2 Timothy, his last letter, perhaps his very last words before he left this earth, the ones recorded for us. He said, "The time of my departure has come," and he says, "I have fought the good fight." And he said, "I've finished the course, and there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me." But I just want you to see the idea of fight. And he tells Timothy, suffer hardship as a good soldier. And he's always talks about the Christian walk really as a battle. In Ephesians chapter 6, we'll look at that verse a little bit. It said, "But our struggle's not against flesh and blood," but he talks about it being a war against the spiritual powers of darkness. So put on the full armor of God so you can stand. Now, who wears armor? Soldiers, all right? And so when we, very interesting comment, and I know the text is small, most of it's just for my memory. Galatians chapter 6, he says, "I bear," in verse 17, "on my body the brand marks of Jesus." Now that's kind of an interesting phrase, the brand or the marks of Jesus. And I put the two words there together. It's probably, he's referring to the scars. What scars? Literal scars from being persecuted. And so that's why he says in Colossians chapter 1, I had to fill up the sufferings of Christ that weren't completed in him. That's an interesting phrase. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 24, that I completed it, all right? And he suffered physically, terribly. And that'll be in chapter 11 and 12. We'll look at some of that in 2 Corinthians here. But it was a war. And now that's why in this section he's talking about the weapons of our warfare and the great battle we have before us. And there's a lot he doesn't say, which like, Paul, could you have finished that paragraph? But of course, by the Spirit, he gave us what we do need to understand, and we'll try to make sense of it. Now let's look at the church at Corinth. Now we know this, but we kind of encapsulate it in our mind again. It started in Acts 18 when Paul traveled there and baptized Crispus and Gaius, but not many other than that. But the church started there on that journey about 50 A.D. Somewhere around 52, they sent a letter to Paul. And they talked about problems. There was division in the church. People were dividing over their favorite preachers. There's immorality in the church. They're making a mess of the Lord's Supper. And so Chloe wrote a letter. Oh, excuse me. I got this wrong. Paul wrote a letter to them, which we don't have. I was talking about Chloe's letter when that little comments. Paul wrote a letter to him, and he refers to it, but we don't have it. So we were going to call it the pre-letter. But then Chloe's household somehow sends information to Paul and talks about all the problems with marriage and everything that is describing. So Paul has to write a really strong letter, which we already studied, called 1 Corinthians. And he addresses this immorality in the church, divisions, lawsuits. They were suing each other, the misuse of spiritual gifts, making a feast out of the Lord's Supper. And it just goes on and on. And he said, I wrote it with tears. It was so hard, but it was severe. Well, he has some enemies in that church. And they've always been undermining Paul, and we're going to see him alluding to it here in just this chapter. They said, Paul is really strong when he's writing from way far, but when he gets here, he's kind of meek and mild. In other words, he's kind of wimpy, and he's just really a fraud. He's a fake, and he's just peddling Christianity for the money. And if he really was a real apostle, and they were going on. So he's had to deal with this. And that's why he said in this letter, do you want me to come with a spirit of gentleness, or do you want me to come with a rod of anger? So basically he's saying, straighten up now, so when I get there, I can be there in gentleness. Well, the report comes back, and what was it? They received his letter and things changed. But there's still an undercurrent, this river that runs deep of opposition to Paul by just a few. Yes, and Paul still has to deal with it. So we see that Paul does visit them and things went well, but then things, spark up again, and Paul writes the 2 Corinthian letter, which we're reading right now, all right? He does refer in this letter to the restored relationships and just rejoiced in how they've repented and things are well. He talked about the grace of giving, but the last 3 chapters we're in now, chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, he's talking about the spiritual warfare that Paul's part of himself. That's what we're looking at right now. He will make a 3rd visit. He refers to it in this book that we're in now, 2 Corinthians 12 and chapter 14 and chapter 13 and verse 1. And when you understand that context, then you're going to understand what he has to say now. He goes, now I, Paul. Now what does he not say when he says, now I, Paul? An apostle, exactly. How does he usually introduce himself? Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, right? Now who's speaking? Paul is. He's going to defend the person to those people that have been opposing him and saying he's a fraud or a phony, that he's weak. I, Paul, and he says, I beg you. So it's a big transition from everything we've been talking about, this grace of giving. Now he's talking about himself and this spiritual warfare we're in. I urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. We're going to show 4 characteristics, next week 5, of a Christian warrior or a Christian soldier. And Paul starts with describing the character trait which he presents himself to the Corinthians. And what is it? Your Bible might say something different, but meekness and gentleness. Some Bibles say gentleness and what? Huh? Lowliness. Some other, anything different. It's translated all sort of different ways, all right? We'll just go with the New American Standard, but he says, meekness is this, sometimes we say it's strength under control, but here in this word, it means more of this. It's this self-control. Did Jesus have strength under control when he was on this earth? Well, that's an obvious question. When did he display strength under control? When he was crucified? When he's before Pilate? When he's frustrated? When he's been beaten, right? And we look at him, I mean, the people that day as someone weak, and a lot of the pictures show him as a weak person and just kind of, you know how he's depicted. No, Jesus is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He was a man of great strength and courage, but it was always under his control. And so when he encountered people, rather than judging and climbing all over them, what did he do? The woman at the well. Talk gentle. That's right. Rather than beat down, tried to offer them hope. Yeah, you've had 6 or 5 husbands, and the man you're with is not your husband. And she said, if you knew who was talking to you, you'd ask me for water, and I'd give you the waters of life. And she says, I perceive you're a prophet. Oh, really? How about the woman that was brought to him caught in adultery? What was his last words? Go and sin no more, because neither do I condemn you. No one left to condemn you. How about the lepers? Did he heal them? You know, he had this control about him. But was he mightily strong? Well, yes. And we have to have whole new artwork of how Jesus presented. The other word, gentleness, is one person has translated it sweet reasonableness. And it has to do with someone that's in control, like a judge or a leader. But it has the idea of fairness or being equitable. Because, well, let's use an officer. An officer pulls you over because technically you were 3 miles over the speed limit. Could he write you a ticket? By the letter of the law. But when he sees that you're just an older lady like my mom, and she always was crying when the officer pulled her over, and says, lady, you know, she would. She'd be proud of it later. I didn't get a ticket. Well, why? Because I cried. Well, she didn't put on the tears as an act. She was just, oh no. And what did the officer show? Gentleness. Yeah, the letter of the law says I should write you up, but you're a grandma, okay? I will have this sweet reasonableness. So it's this character. I'm not going to exact the exact letter of the law. I'm going to give wiggle room. I understand that things happen. Do you appreciate that out of your leaders and people like officers or your boss that are people that are understanding? Did Jesus show this thing we call sweet reasonableness or this fairness about him? Yeah, he always went the extra mile, and that's what he said to do. You go the extra mile. Paul's saying, that's what I had. Yeah. When I was there, I was kind and gentle. Yeah, I spoke softly. Yeah, but that doesn't mean I don't have strength. And he's going to come back to that. But that's really the sign of a Christian soldier. They have lots of strength and power, but they know how to use it correctly. Some thoughts about it. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, blessed are the gentle. It's the same word here, meek, but gentle, because they're going to inherit the earth. It's interesting, in 1 Peter chapter 3, speaking of a woman, though, a wife, he said, this imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit is precious in God's eyes. But we also see it's a fruit of the Spirit. That if you're a Christian and you're attached to Christ and the Spirit's living in you, this is love, self-control, and this is gentleness is one of them. We also see in Galatians chapter 6, that ye who are spiritual, if someone's caught up in a trespass of sin, you go to them with a spirit of meekness or gentleness. Same word. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says, correcting those who are in opposition, but he says, with what? Gentleness. You have the truth, you have the right to correct, but how do you correct them, even though they're in the air? With this sweet reasonableness and gentleness. Now, isn't that the way you want your parents to correct you? Give you a chance to give your side of the story? Or just fly off the handle, go to your room and don't you ever question me? Is that what you want to hear? Or do you want some idea of fairness? Yes.
No, it's just, the gentleness, the gentle spirit. It's just, the kindness. When you show kindness, it's hard to get angry at someone who's being kind to you. And
It's a lot harder, yes.
yeah, it is a lot harder. And so if you got somebody that's already, let's say, out of duty or what the situation is, and you come at them harshly, well, then they're going to be more defensive. But if you're gentle and say, I'm really concerned for your soul and what's going on, that's a whole other approach.
It has a whole different, yes.
I would say also, it's easier to go from gentleness to hardness.
Yes.
From hardness to gentleness.
That's true too. Yes.
It was interesting to see who Jesus treated more harshly than not. It was those who were supposed to have known better, the Pharisees and Sadducees of the educated law, that called them the root of vipers and serpents and woes. But to everyone else,
Yeah. This gentleness, wasn't there?
we see this demonstrated in the book of Acts with Aquila and Priscilla when they take Apollos aside privately
Oh, yeah.
and teach him the word of God
Yeah.
so perfectly. He was a great eloquent
Yeah.
speaker, but they did that, I'm sure, in the spirit of gentleness.
Yeah, and so I just say this, if this is a trait of Paul, it's a trait of Christ, and he said, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. There have been, and I don't want to characterize all Christians because that's not fair, it's a stereotype, but there have been times in the past where people in the name of Christ have really beat other people over the head, with just almost a condemning, judgmental, it's not a gentle approach. And that's not the way we were won. That's not what we wanted to receive. And if we've got grace from a gentle Savior, we should always extend that to others. Does that mean we waffle on the truth and we compromise? No, because Paul's going to show I can be very strong. But the way you speak the truth in, love. So there's the first characteristic of a Christian soldier. And when you approach someone, and I don't know, no matter what it is, when you pray about it before you approach them, just in your prayer, just ask yourself, now, how can I express gentleness to them? How can I put myself in their shoes? How can I be a listener as well as just a speaker? Yes, Heather.
I just really appreciate what you said about a spirit of gentleness instead of just coming at them with that judgmental attitude, because I was just thinking based off of experience visiting or working with other churches. Sometimes I think the environment there breeds that, and people just learn to be judgmental because it's like part of knowing the scripture and applying it and being right
Yeah.
And like, in the big picture, what they don't realize is, like you're saying, that's not the right spirit. It's
Yeah.
really not the mature Christian, it's not the real Christianity. I don't know how to
Yeah.
say it. It's not.
Because the people were trying to say, if we come across that approach, you're like, you should know better. No, they don't know better. And if they do matter, they're trying to get out. They need someone to help them get out. But often they're just ignorant. They don't know. But often we create that. We breed this attitude, like you say, because, and I'll give an example later, where it's easy to breed it by always talking about how the world is so wrong and they're all so bad and they're all going to hell. And if we constantly talk that way here amongst ourselves, what's that going to do? What kind of attitude will that create in you about the world? Oh, they're evil. They're bad. And so we have to be careful and temper the way we speak about others or what's going on. Because we can talk about what's going on without condemning the individuals. All right? Yes?
Follow-up real quick.
Oh, okay.
Just love me.
Good. Real quick. Did someone else? Did I get you? All right, go ahead. You've had your hand up a long time.
One of the things we have to be very careful just doesn't permeate our attitude. We in the church sometimes consider ourselves the religious conservatives of our day.
Yes.
Well, guess what? The Pharisees and Sadducees thought they were the religious
Yeah. It didn't go over very well, did it?
well. So we
No.
have to be careful of our attitude.
Yeah. All right. Can I go on?
It was just what the apostles, when they rejected Jesus, they wanted to call down fire, and what was
Yeah.
Jesus' response?
So you don't know what kind of spirit you're of, right? He said when James and John wanted to call down fire. All right. I'd like to read 1 Peter 2, but for time I won't. But that gentleness finds favor with God. He said, when you're harshly treated and you endure it, he said, this finds favor with God, because that's the way Christ was, and he uses that example. Paul says, I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling. He said, yeah, I was that way. He acknowledges it. But that doesn't mean I was weak. See, his enemies are using it to say, oh, Paul's a coward. He's weak. Well, wait. How did you want me to come? And so if he would have came abrasive and mean, they say, oh, Paul's abrasive and mean, and he doesn't love. He's just lording it over us. So enemies, doesn't matter how you present yourself, what are they going to do? Characterize it as bad, no matter how you present yourself. So Paul says, yeah, I am who meek when face to face with you, but bold toward you when absent. What is he saying there? I put it in red. What's he saying? Who's he quoting? His enemies. He's being really sarcastic here. He's saying, I'm begging you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. That's where I get it from. I, who am meek and when face to face with you, but bold towards you when absent. Like I'm really powerful in my letters, but I'm just kind of wimpy. No, this is the characteristic of Christ. He's being sarcastic towards them and trying to shame them. He said, I ask that when I'm present, I need not be bold with confidence. I don't want to be bold and confronting. I want you to take care of these things before I get there. You work out your relationship with God so I can come there and be what? That gentle spirit, all right? Does that make sense, what he's saying here? So he says, when I'm present, I don't want to be bold with the confidence which I propose to be courageous against some. Who are the some, you think? His enemies, all right? With some who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. That means Paul's just walking according to the carnal desires of this world, and he's really he's a fraud. That's what this accusation is. So let's look at these words. The word bold means to exercise really courage. So the second trait of a Christian soldier, they're courageous. They're bold. Now, bold doesn't mean they climb all over you, because it's always tempered with what? Gentleness. But where does their courage come from? From Christ. Huh? From submission to Christ. And it comes from, also, Jesus said, if you abide in my word, you shall know the truth. The truth is going to set you free. And there's something about truth when you have it, it makes you courageous. Because you can see lies now. And when you have the truth, and you're not in any doubt anymore, because when you don't have the truth, you're tossed here and there. You don't know what to believe. But when you have the truth and you know it's the truth, you can be pulled. You say, no, that's not right. You don't have to say it mean. You don't have to yell. You say, no, that's not right. I'm sorry, no, you're wrong. That's not right. That's not what the Lord said. And it makes you courageous where you might have been a little scared, intimidated. But Paul said, I'm bold. And he says, I'm going to be courageous against some. Now this, actually the word translated courageous in the New American Standard really means to be daring or fearless. And is that required of a really good soldier to be courageous, but sometimes he has to be real daring to rush the front line, to do things that are fearless, like, why would you do that? Weren't you scared? Yes, I was scared to death. Why'd you do it? Courage. Courage. They say people that are in war, it's not that they're not afraid, but they overcome their fear, and they're not, a coward runs because of fear, but someone that's courageous will still go forward. Now, we're not talking about jumping out of planes, but it's the same thing, right? Why would you jump out of a plane? To teach yourself courage to overcome and be fearless, all right? So that's why, all right. Does that make sense, what we're talking about here, this word courageous? Paul says, when I'll come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I shall find out, not the words of those who are arrogant, but their power. We're going to find out who's really courageous and who has the truth here. All right, that was his message in 1 Corinthians 1. All right, now, notice what he says in verse 3. We already read this, but you can see it again. For though we walk in the flesh. Now, what are his enemies accusing him of? Just walking in the flesh. Now, why does Paul say, well, yeah, we do walk in the flesh? He's not saying the flesh the way they're saying, like you're just worldly men, Paul. Paul's using this, yeah, we're just humans. And that's really what he's going to be saying. Our power and strength is not of ourselves, it's from Christ. And so look at this. The idea of the traits of a Christian soldier, they're gentle, they're courageous, but they're equipped. Paul said, put on the full armor of God, right? They're equipped because they've got some weapons. Now, notice we don't war according to the flesh, the way the world wars. But our weapons of warfare, because they're not of the world, but they're divinely powerful. That word divinely is the word theos, which we get atheism or theism. And it's a word which we get dynamite from. These are divinely powerful weapons for destroying what? Fortresses. So I define some of the words. War there means to make war, to serve as a soldier. So he says, we are not in this war as a soldier. This is all battle that he's in. And we don't use physical weapons. The word weapons really means instruments to make wars. And he talked about in chapter 6 and verse 7, the instruments of righteousness or weapons of righteousness in the right hand and the left hand. They're not physical weapons, but they're going to be spiritual. Paul said in Ephesians 6, we already referred to it, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. What good would a gun do against a spiritual enemy? Nothing. It won't help. So when we understand the nature of our battle, it's spiritual, not physical. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I don't care who's opposing you, who you're trying to deal with. That person is never your enemy. Never. Because what did Paul say? We are not fighting against flesh and blood. Who is your enemy? Satan, who's held them captive. So if you're going to get mad, who do you get mad at? Satan, not them. And if you always think that, it'll temper your attitude towards people that do you wrong or speak evil of you or just causing corruption in the world. And we speak sometimes really poorly of our fellow man, and some of them are evil, I get it, but the real enemy is who? Satan, all right? And if you always keep that in mind, it'll help temper your attitude towards them and have this sweet reasonableness that Jesus did. Because if anyone who had a hard time living amongst the natives, it was Jesus, right? So the weapons are the tools you wage war with. The destruction means to demolish, just totally demolish. Well, what's this fortress that he's talking about? But notice we walk in the flesh. He's talking about we're humans, but that's okay. Because we've got divine weapons. So where's the power from? Not in of myself. It's in what God's going to equip us with. So the trait of a Christian soldier that's going to be successful and survive, they're equipped, they're prepared, and it makes them competent. They're highly capable because they've been trained and they're skilled because they've been equipped with these weapons. And of course, that's the exhortation Paul gives in Ephesians 4, that we're supposed to equip the saints for the work of service till we're fully mature like Christ. Now, we got to ask some questions. What are these weapons of the flesh, first of all? You don't have a lot of time. But don't think bullets and weapons like a gun there. Because the weapons of the world that assail against God are spiritual too. Because who's our battle against? Spiritual forces of wickedness. Now, they use the flesh, but they use all these things. The idea of human wisdom, human philosophies, human religion. They do use power, force, intimidation, coercion in governments and armies. They do use poverty and dependence. They do use seduction and flattery. But these are all the weapons of the world and how they get Christians to succumb. And it's very effective. But does anyone know what this is? Why'd you say it's a toy? It has an orange tip. Good for you. You don't even have kids. You have boys. What kind of toy is it? It's an airsoft gun. You know what it shoots just little poof. Will it hurt you? Will it hurt you? You might go, ow. Ow. And I put that up there because all the weapons of the world against you spiritually are like little darts. Like we used to shoot little guns with corks in them. They're worthless. They can't do any harm. They have no impact on this war because they're not divinely powerful. You got that? Now, what are the fortresses? On the hill above the town of Corinth was this place called Acrocorinth, and that's where the Acropolis stood. It was a fortress. And so when you're going to be attacked, where would all the people in the city flow to? The walled fortress where you'd be safe. Do you think Paul's referring to this? It's the only place the word fortress is found in the Bible. It's in this text. Being there, has he been in this Acropolis? You know he has, probably taught there. And he's using it as a figure, says the world has these fortresses that we think, and isn't that true? We think there's evil in the world, there's things that are going on, and we just throw up, what can we do? I mean, it just keep on going. They get more and more powerful, and we'll name some of them in just a second. And Paul says, no, we have weapons that will totally annihilate them. Oh, really? Yeah. Now we're out of time. But there's a great battle coming up, and you got to come back next week to see how it turns out. All right? All right.